cold metal tastes like old blood. That was her first lesson. Not the betrayal of her brother's shaky signature on a ledger, nor the men who dragged her from her mattress by her hair. It was the chain. 3 feet of heavy iron tethering her ankle to a concrete wall in a room that smelled of mildew, wet earth, and stale gin. She wasn't some tragic heroine waiting for salvation. She was a line item crossed out in a ledger, a breathing sack of flesh traded to a man who preferred the dark. Concrete dust coated the inside of Naomi's mouth. She swallowed, grimacing as the grit scraped her dry throat. Her cheek was pressed against the basement floor, the stone leaching the last bits of body heat through her thin cotton t-shirt. Her right ankle throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The steel cuff wasn't lined. It bit directly into her skin, and after what she guessed was 12 hours of frantic, panicked pulling, she had worn the flesh raw. A sticky warmth had seeped down to her heel, her own blood drying in the frigid air. Declan's face kept flashing behind her eyelids. Her older brother. The twitch in his left eye when he was high, the smell of cheap beer and desperation sweating out of his pores. "It's just for a few days, Naomi," he had stammered, backing toward the apartment door as the 2 massive men with thick necks and dead eyes pushed their way inside. "Just collateral. I swear to God, I'll get the money." He hadn't looked at her. That was the detail that twisted in her gut like a serrated knife. He had stared at the baseboards. A heavy thump echoed from above, followed by the muffled scrape of a chair moving across hardwood. Naomi curled tighter into a ball, bringing her knees to her chest. She wanted to be angry, to feel that burning, righteous fury she had read about in books, but all she felt was a hollow, nauseating terror. Her stomach cramped violently. She dry-heaved over the dirty floor, bringing up nothing but stringy, bitter saliva. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, heavy, unhurried. They weren't the erratic, rushing steps of the grunts who had thrown her down here. These steps possessed a terrifying rhythm, measured, precise. The deadbolt threw with a sharp, metallic clack that made Naomi flinch so hard her chained ankle jerked, sending a fresh spike of agony up her leg. Light spilled into the room from the hallway, blinding her. She squinted, throwing a hand over her face. The silhouette in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely still. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by Naomi's own ragged, uneven breathing. He stepped into the room, pulling the door shut behind him. The darkness returned, absolute and crushing, save for a thin sliver of pale yellow light creeping under the doorframe. A match flared. The sudden burst of illumination caught the sharp angle of a jaw, a straight nose, and eyes that were the flat, unreflective color of slate. Nico. She didn't know his last name, only the whispers Declan had muttered in his sleep during his worst withdrawals. "Nico's going to kill me. Nico's going to peel my skin off." He touched the match to a cigarette, inhaling slowly. The tip glowed bright orange, casting long, warped shadows against the cracked concrete walls. The smell of burning tobacco and sharp sulfur cut through the dampness of the room. He flicked the match away. It hissed out in a puddle near the wall. "You look exactly like him," Nico said. His voice wasn't a deep, theatrical rumble. It was perfectly ordinary, smooth and quiet, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the voice of a man negotiating the price of lumber, not a human life. Naomi tried to speak, but her vocal cords seized. She cleared her throat, a pathetic, scratching sound. "Please." Nico took another drag. He walked toward her. His shoes, leather, hard-soled, scuffed against the grit. He crouched just out of her reach. She could smell him now. Clean linen, an undercurrent of copper and expensive spicy cologne. The contrast between his polished presence and the filth of her cage made her stomach roll again. "He owes me $3.2 million, Nico stated, resting his forearms on his knees. "He offered you as a down payment." "I don't have money," Naomi whispered, her voice cracking. She hated how small she sounded. She wanted to scream, to spit in his face, but her body was betraying her, shaking so violently her teeth clicked together. "I work at a diner. I make $14 an hour. I can't." "I don't want your money, Naomi." He knew her name. The casual way he said it made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Declan's debt is a stain on my books. I don't tolerate stains. You are here to ensure he feels the exact pressure required to liquidate his remaining assets." "He doesn't have anything." Naomi's voice broke into a jagged sob. The dam cracked. Hot, humiliating tears spilled over her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt. "He has nothing. He sold everything. He sold me!" Nico watched her cry. He didn't look amused, nor did he look sympathetic. He observed her with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a nerve twitch under a scalpel. He reached out. Naomi scrambled backward, her back slamming against the damp wall, the chain going taut with a vicious clank. Nico's hand stopped in midair. He didn't force the contact. Instead, he let his hand drop to the floor, his fingers brushing the heavy iron links of her chain. He traced the metal, his touch light, almost absent-minded. "Fear is a useful mechanism," Nico said softly, staring at the rust on his fingertips. "It keeps animals alive in the woods, but down here, it will just exhaust you." He stood up, towering over her in the gloom. He dropped the half-smoked cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it beneath the toe of his shoe. "Get some sleep. We leave in an hour." He turned and walked away. The heavy door opened, blinding her again, and then slammed shut. The deadbolt snapped back into place. Naomi was left in the dark, the smell of his tobacco hanging in the air, her cheek pressed back against the freezing floor. She didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and let the dark swallow her. The transition was violent, not in action, but in sensory shock. Naomi's arms had been zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cut into her wrists, tight enough to make her fingers numb and clumsy. A rough burlap sack was pulled over her head, smelling intensely of dust and old potatoes. The fibers scratched her nose, making her sneeze, which only resulted in her inhaling more dust. She was guided, shoved really, by hands that didn't care about bruising her. The air shifted from the heavy, stagnant damp of the basement to the crisp, freezing bite of night air. Gravel crunched under boots. A car door opened, releasing the smell of fresh, rich leather. She was pushed into the back seat. Someone sat next to her, their body heat radiating in the cramped space, but they didn't speak. The engine purred, a deep, expensive vibration that vibrated through the floorboards into her bare feet. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut beneath the hood. Her bladder ached. The sheer, overwhelming terror had paralyzed her nervous system, and for a humiliating second, she thought she was going to lose control right there on the leather seats. She bit her lower lip hard enough to taste blood, using the sharp pain to ground herself. Don't break down. Don't let them see you break. The drive felt like it lasted hours, though her internal clock was fractured. When the car finally stopped, the doors opened and the cold air rushed in again. She was pulled out by her bicep. "Walk," a gruff voice muttered. Not Nico. One of his shadows. She stumbled blindly up concrete steps, her bare toes catching on a lip, sending her pitching forward. Before her face could smash into the stone, a hand grabbed the collar of her shirt, hauling her upright, choking her slightly. She gasped, coughing into the burlap. They moved indoors. The temperature rose drastically. The floors beneath her feet changed from rough stone to smooth, polished wood, then to thick, plush carpeting that silenced their footsteps. Doors opened and closed. Finally, she was shoved forward, landing hard on her knees on a carpeted floor. The zip ties on her wrists were snipped with a sharp click of shears. The burlap sack was yanked off. Naomi gasped, sucking in clean, conditioned air, blinking rapidly against the sudden light. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a bedroom, but it was entirely, unsettlingly wrong. The walls were painted a dark, flat charcoal. The furniture, a massive bed, a heavy oak dresser, was austere, devoid of any personal touches. There were no pictures, no mirrors, and most terrifyingly, no windows. The walls were solid, unbroken expanses of dark grey. The only light came from recessed bulbs in the ceiling, glowing with a harsh, artificial white intensity. And there, bolted to the floor near the foot of the bed, was a heavy steel D-ring. Attached to it was a new chain. This one wasn't rusted iron. It was modern, shining steel, thick and heavy. Nico stood by the door, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He watched her rub her raw, red wrists. "The bathroom is through that door." Nico pointed to a heavy oak door to her left. "It has no locks. There is clothing in the dresser. Put something clean on. You smell like my basement." Naomi's jaw trembled. She looked from him to the shiny steel chain on the floor. "What is that?" she rasped. Nico didn't look at the chain. He looked at her eyes. "That is an insurance policy. Declan missed his check-in an hour ago. He's running." "So you're going to keep me tied up like a dog?" Her voice was getting louder, the panic morphing into a brittle, jagged hysteria. "He doesn't care about me. If he's running, keeping me here won't bring him back." "He will care," Nico said, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like an absolute truth, a law of physics he was reciting. Because every day he doesn't surface, a piece of you will be mailed to him. And Declan, for all his flaws, has a weak stomach. Naomi stopped breathing. The room spun. The charcoal walls seemed to close in, compressing her lungs. She looked at Nico's face, searching for a tell, a sign that he was bluffing to scare her. His expression was a smooth, unreadable mask of flesh and bone. He meant it. He was going to cut her to pieces. She didn't try to run. She didn't scream. Instead, a bizarre, detached wave of exhaustion washed over her. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the plush carpet, her forehead resting against the soft fibers. It smelled of chemical carpet cleaner. Nico watched her fold in on herself. He walked over to the chain. He picked up the padded leather cuff attached to the end of it. "Give me your ankle." Naomi kept her face pressed to the floor. "No." It was a whisper, pathetic and weak. A hand gripped her calf, the fingers brutally strong, biting into the muscle. She cried out as he hauled her leg backward. The cool leather cuff wrapped around her raw, chafed ankle. A padlock clicked shut with a heavy, final snap. Nico stood up. He walked to the door. "Clean yourself. I will have food brought up." The lights clicked off. Naomi was left in pitch blackness. Not the dim, shadowy dark of a regular room at night. This was an absolute, suffocating void, the kind of dark that pressed against the eyeballs. She lay there on the carpet, the heavy steel chain resting against her leg, and for the first time since the men had kicked her door down, she felt the true weight of her reality. She wasn't a person anymore. She was currency, and she was spending it in the dark. Time didn't flow in the windowless room. It pooled. It stagnated in thick, heavy intervals, measured only by the clicks of the door lock. Naomi learned the topography of her prison by touch. The chain gave her exactly 8 feet of slack from the bolt in the floor. She could reach the edge of the mattress. She could reach the bathroom door, but she couldn't step fully inside. She had to lean over the threshold to use the sink to drink water from her cupped hands. The dresser was a foot out of her reach. The lights remained off. She spent the first indeterminate number of hours curled at the base of the bed, crying until her tear ducts felt like dry sandpaper. When the tears stopped, the anger finally crept in. It was an ugly, crawling thing in her chest. She hated Declan. She hated him so intensely it frightened her. She imagined his throat between her hands, squeezing until his eyes bulged. It was a survival mechanism, this hatred. It kept the crushing despair at bay. The lock clicked. The handle turned. Naomi scrambled backward, hitting the baseboard. The door opened, throwing a rectangle of hallway light onto the carpet. Nico stepped in. He carried a silver tray. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He set the tray down on the floor, just inside the reach of her chain. Eat. He stood there, a dark silhouette against the light from the hall. Naomi stared at the tray. The smell hit her then. Roasted meat, garlic, butter. Her stomach contracted violently, letting out a loud, embarrassing growl. She hadn't eaten in 2 days? 3? She didn't know. "I'm not eating off the floor," she spat, her voice raspy from disuse. It was a stupid, pointless rebellion. But she needed it. Nico didn't move. Hunger is a choice right now, Naomi. Tomorrow, it might be a necessity. Eat. She stared at the vague outline of his legs. Her hand twitched. Before her brain could catch up with her instinct, she lunged. She grabbed the heavy ceramic plate from the tray and hurled it blindly toward his silhouette. The plate shattered against the wall near his knees with a loud crash. Gravy and meat splattered across the charcoal paint and the carpet. Naomi fell back onto her palms, her chest heaving, waiting for the blow. Waiting for a kick to her ribs or the click of a gun. Nico stood perfectly still. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. He slowly looked down at the mess on the carpet, then back at her shadow in the dark. "Clean it up," he said, his voice stripped of any inflection. "Go to hell." Naomi's voice shook, betraying her bravado. Nico took a step forward, then another. He moved with a terrifying grace. He crouched in front of her. In the dim light from the hallway, she could finally see his face. His jaw was clenched, a muscle feathering near his ear. He didn't hit her. He reached out and grabbed her right wrist. Naomi gasped, trying to jerk her arm back, but his grip was like a steel vice. He pulled her hand forward, opening her palm. When she had thrown the plate, her fingers had slipped. A sharp, jagged shard of the ceramic had sliced across the pad of her thumb. It was bleeding, a slow, dark trickle dripping onto the carpet. She hadn't even felt it. Nico stared at the blood. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a pristine, white cotton handkerchief. Without a word, he wrapped it tightly around her thumb, pressing his thumb against hers to apply pressure. His hands were warm. It was jarring, sickeningly intimate. The man who had chained her to the floor like an animal was now carefully bandaging a minor cut. The contradiction messed with her head, making her dizzy. "You are damaging my leverage," Nico murmured, his eyes fixed on her hand. "Don't break my things, Naomi. It makes me incredibly impatient." He released her hand. He stood up, picked up the silver tray with the remaining glass of water, and turned away. "Wait," she blurted out. The word hung in the air, desperate and needy. Nico paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Please don't turn off the light," she whispered, hating herself. hating how quickly the dark broke her. "Please, I can't breathe in the dark." Nico looked at her, his face half lit by the hallway bulb. He studied her for a long, agonizing second. He reached out and closed the door. The absolute blackness slammed back down on her. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing, the sharp sting in her thumb, the only proof she was still alive. Scraping dried meat from synthetic carpet fibers in total darkness was an exercise in degradation. Naomi worked blindly, her fingernails snagging on the greasy, stiffened tufts of the rug. Every time she brushed against a sharp shard of the broken plate, she flinched, her breath hitching in the pitch black. The handkerchief wrapped around her right thumb was damp and stiff with dried blood. She pushed the broken ceramic into a rough pile near the wall, her movements slow, mechanical. The air in the room had gone stale, smelling of cold grease and her own sour sweat. She had crawled to the bathroom twice to drink from the faucet, straining against the heavy steel tether. The metal cuff had bruised the bone of her ankle, a deep, radiating ache that made putting weight on her right leg impossible. She sat back on her heels, resting her forehead on her knees. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It had settled into a vast, hollow cavity beneath her ribs, making her limbs feel leaden and uncoordinated. The heavy metallic clack of the deadbolt sent a violent jolt through her nervous system. Light flooded the room. Naomi threw her hands over her eyes, curling into a tight ball on the floor, waiting for the burning in her retinas to subside. Footsteps. Slow. Leather soles on carpet. She lowered her hands. Nico stood near the foot of the bed. He wasn't wearing the suit jacket today. He wore a dark, fitted dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a faded, jagged scar running parallel to his left wrist. He held a simple white plastic chair in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. He set the chair down, exactly 3 feet out of her reach. He sat, resting his forearms on his thighs, the paper bag dangling from his fingers. "I had a dog once," Nico said. His voice was conversational, utterly devoid of the malice Naomi expected. A Belgian Malinois, extremely intelligent, highly volatile. Naomi stared at him, her lips dry and cracked. She didn't speak. She tracked the paper bag with her eyes, a humiliating spike of saliva pooling in her mouth. "When I first brought him home, he refused to eat from a bowl. He would only eat if I dropped the meat on the dirt." Nico tilted his head, studying her disheveled hair, her dirt-smudged face, the defensive hunch of her shoulders. It took 2 weeks of fasting before he understood that the bowl wasn't a trap. It was the only option. He reached into the bag and pulled out a plain, thick sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a green apple. He placed them on the floor, sliding them across the carpet until they stopped inches from her knee. "I don't have 2 weeks to train you, Naomi. Eat." She wanted to throw it at him. She wanted to scream that she wasn't a dog, that he was a monster. But her stomach gave a sharp, agonizing twist. Her hands shook as she reached for the sandwich. The wax paper crinkled loudly in the silent room. She took a bite. It was just cold turkey and plain bread, but it tasted violently rich. She chewed frantically, swallowing large, unchewed lumps that scraped down her dry esophagus. Nico watched her eat. He didn't look away, nor did he offer water. He just sat in the white plastic chair, an immovable object in her shrinking universe. When she finished, licking a stray crumb from her thumb, she looked up. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice rasping. "He boarded a Greyhound bus in Pittsburgh yesterday morning," Nico answered, his tone flat. "He got off in Cleveland. He withdrew $300 from a depleted checking account. He is running out of ground. He won't come back. Naomi pulled her knees tightly to her chest, resting her chin on her knees. He owes you $3 million. 300 isn't going to fix that. He's a coward. Everyone is a coward when the bill comes due. Nico stood up. He picked up the empty paper bag. But Declan has a fundamental flaw. He requires an audience for his misery. He can't suffer in a vacuum. He will reach out to someone, and when he does, my people will be on the other end of the line. He walked toward the door. Please, Naomi said. The word tasted like ash. Don't turn off the light. I'll do whatever you want. Just leave the light on. Nico paused in the doorway. He looked at the heavy steel chain, then up to her face. You don't have anything I want, Naomi. You only have what Declan needs. He hit the switch. The darkness crashed down again. Bleach fumes stung her nostrils, cutting through the stale air. Naomi woke with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room was bathed in harsh, blinding overhead light. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away from the glare. Get up. The voice was not Nico's. It was thicker, rougher, laced with a heavy Brooklyn accent. She opened her eyes, squinting against the brightness. 2 men stood in her room. One was the man who had spoken, built like a brick wall in a cheap leather jacket. The other was Nico. He stood near the dresser, his expression neutral, holding a small, black Polaroid camera. I said, get up, the grunt repeated, taking a step toward her. Naomi scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall. The steel chain clanked loudly against the floor. Don't touch me, she croaked. Nico raised a hand, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. The grunt stopped instantly, stepping back. Sit on the edge of the mattress, Nico instructed. Naomi looked at the bed. It was clean, massive, covered in a dark grey duvet. It was exactly 2 feet out of her current reach. She looked down at the chain, then at Nico. Nico walked over to the D-ring, bolted to the floor. He crouched, pulling a small silver key from his pocket. He unlocked the heavy padlock. The sudden release of tension on her ankle was disorienting. For a fraction of a second, her brain calculated the distance to the door, the speed of the 2 men, her own weakened state. Nico didn't even look up. If you run, he breaks your legs. Both of them. And then I chain you back to the floor. The calculation died in her throat. She stood up slowly, her right leg shaking, the bruised ankle screaming in protest as she put weight on it. She limped toward the bed, sinking onto the edge of the mattress. The mattress was incredibly soft, a stark, jarring contrast to the concrete and thin carpet she had been living on. It made her feel dirty, leaving a smudge of grime on the pristine grey fabric. Nico approached her. He stopped a few feet away, raising the Polaroid camera. What are you doing? Naomi asked, her voice trembling. Declan needs motivation. He needs to know his collateral is still breathing. Nico adjusted the lens. Look at the camera. Naomi stared at the black plastic square. The reality of the situation hit her with fresh, nauseating clarity. She was a prop, a hostage photo. Declan was going to see this. He was going to see her sitting on a bed in a dark room, dirty, chained, and terrified. A sudden, sharp spike of anger pierced through the exhaustion. It was hot and bitter. Declan had put her here. Declan had left her in the dark. She straightened her spine. She pushed her tangled, greasy hair out of her face. She didn't cower. She stared directly into the lens, her jaw clenched, her eyes flat and dead. She refused to give Nico the satisfaction of a tear. She refused to give Declan the satisfaction of her terror. Nico paused. He lowered the camera slightly, his slate-grey eyes studying her face. He noted the shift in her posture, the sudden rigidity in her shoulders, the coldness in her stare. "Are you smiling?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "I'm surviving," Naomi shot back, her voice remarkably steady. "Take the picture." Nico didn't move for a long second. The air in the room grew heavy, the tension thick enough to choke on. The grunt near the door shifted his weight uncomfortably. Then, Nico raised the camera again. The flash was blinding, an explosive burst of white light that left a blue-green after-image burned into Naomi's retinas. She blinked rapidly, turning her head away. Nico pulled the square photograph from the slot at the bottom of the camera. He shook it gently by the white border, watching the chemicals react, the image slowly blooming out of the dark plastic. He walked over and tossed the developing photo onto the mattress beside her. Naomi looked down. The image was harsh, overexposed by the flash. She looked awful. Her cheekbones were sharp, shadows bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. Her lips were cracked, her t-shirt stained. But her eyes were chilling. They stared out from the glossy paper with a hollow, feral intensity. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like something that would bite if you reached a hand into its cage. "He won't care," Naomi whispered, staring at the photo. "He'll look at this, and he'll just keep running." "We'll see." Nico stepped closer. He reached down, grasping the heavy chain near her ankle. Naomi stiffened, expecting him to drag her back to the D-ring. Instead, he hooked the padlock through a sturdy iron loop attached to the heavy oak bed frame. He clicked the lock shut. Naomi stared at the lock, then up at him, bewildered. "What are you doing?" "The D-ring is for the feral," Nico said smoothly. "You showed restraint. You get the bed." He turned and walked toward the door, signaling the grunt to follow. "Wait!" Naomi called out, panic rising as he reached for the light switch. "The light! Please!" Nico stopped. He looked at the wall switch, then back at her, sitting on the edge of the massive bed. "You have a window in the bathroom," he said. "It's small, frosted glass, near the ceiling. It lets in the moonlight." He flipped the switch. The absolute dark didn't return. Instead, a very faint, pale, silvery glow spilled out from the half-open bathroom door. It wasn't much, just enough to see the vague outlines of the furniture, enough to know she wasn't entirely swallowed by the void. The door closed, the deadbolt engaged. Naomi sat on the edge of the soft mattress, listening to the silence. She looked toward the faint sliver of moonlight bleeding from the bathroom. She lay back slowly, her dirty clothes touching the expensive duvet. She curled onto her side, pulling her knees up, the chain clinking softly against the wooden bed frame. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes without fighting the dark. Water pressure was a luxury she had forgotten. Standing under the scalding spray of the bathroom shower, Naomi watched the water pooling around the drain turn a muddy, rust-flecked brown. The heavy steel chain trailed out of the glass enclosure, disappearing under the bathroom door and connecting to the bed frame in the other room. It scraped against the white hexagonal floor tiles every time she shifted her weight, a constant, grating reminder that cleanliness did not equate to freedom. She scrubbed her skin with a harsh, unscented bar of soap she found on the marble vanity until her flesh was pink and stinging. She wanted to wash away the smell of the damp basement, the copper tang of her own dried blood, and the lingering scent of Nico's expensive tobacco. But mostly, she wanted to scrub away the phantom sensation of the concrete floor against her cheek. Stepping out of the shower, the chilled, air-conditioned air of the bathroom hit her wet skin, making her shiver violently. She wrapped a thick, plush towel around her shoulders. The frosted glass window near the ceiling, a rectangle no larger than a shoebox, was glowing with the dull, grey light of overcast daylight. It was daytime. Her internal clock, shattered by the absolute darkness of the previous days, slowly began to recalibrate. Dragging the chain behind her, She limped into the main bedroom. The overhead lights were off, the room illuminated only by the grey ambient light spilling from the bathroom. She opened the heavy oak dresser. Inside, neatly folded in sharp, uniform stacks, were clothes. No dresses, no lingerie, just thick cotton sweatpants, plain t-shirts, and heavy wool socks. Everything was in shades of black, grey, and muted navy. She pulled on a black t-shirt and grey sweatpants. They were massive, swallowing her thin frame, the hems of the pants dragging over her bare feet. They smelled of cedar wood and an aggressively neutral laundry detergent. Naomi sat on the edge of the mattress, running a towel through her dripping hair. Her right ankle throbbed. The hot water had softened the raw, chafed skin beneath the leather cuff, and now it burned with a fresh, pulsing heat. The heavy lock on the bedroom door clicked. Naomi froze, her hands gripping the damp towel in her lap. The door swung open. Nico stood in the threshold, but the harsh hallway light was entirely blocked by his wide shoulders. He stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind him, plunging the room back into the muted, shadowy grey of the bathroom spillover. He didn't have a tray of food this time. He held a small, black smartphone. "Your brother received the photograph," Nico said. He didn't sit in the plastic chair today. He walked slowly toward the foot of the bed, his hard-soled shoes silent on the plush carpet. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the black rectangle in his hand. Did he say anything? Nico stopped at the edge of her mattress. He looked down at her, taking in the oversized clothes, her wet, tangled hair, and the way her hands gripped the towel until her knuckles were white. "He panicked," Nico stated, his voice a flat, emotionless hum. "The visual evidence of your captivity disrupted his rational thought process. He called a mutual acquaintance in Chicago, begging for a loan to cover the principal. He offered a 30% interest rate." A bizarre, desperate flutter of hope sparked in Naomi's chest. It was a pathetic, fragile thing, but she couldn't stop it. "So he's trying to pay you? He's trying to get me out?" Nico tilted his head slightly. The shadows in the room obscured his eyes, making his face an unreadable mask. "The acquaintance he called is a man named Silver. Silver and I have a complicated history regarding territory. Declan didn't just ask for a loan, Naomi. He offered Silver the location of my primary distribution warehouse in exchange for the capital to pay me off." The fragile spark of hope snuffed out, replaced by a cold, leaden dread dropping into her stomach. "I don't understand. Declan tried to sell my assets to my enemy to settle his debt with me," Nico clarified, stepping closer. The scent of his spicy cologne and fresh linen overpowered the cedar smell of her clothes. "He weaponized his own incompetence." "What does that mean for him?" Naomi asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "It means his debt is no longer purely financial," Nico said smoothly. "It is now a matter of security. He has made himself a liability. And me?" She looked up at him, her chest heaving. "What does it mean for me? I don't know anything about warehouses. I don't know Silver. You have no reason to keep me here if the money doesn't matter anymore." Nico looked down at the steel chain, looping around the bedpost, then back up to her face. He pocketed the phone. "You are still his leverage. Silver declined the offer and called me immediately. Declan is out of options, out of money, and out of allies. He is trapped in a cheap motel outside of Detroit. My men are sitting in a car across the street." "Then let me go." Naomi stood up. The sudden movement made her dizzy, black spots dancing in her peripheral vision. She swayed, her knees buckling slightly. "If you have him, you don't need me. Let me go." Nico didn't reach out to steady her. He watched her regain her balance, his posture perfectly relaxed. I don't release liabilities into the wind, Naomi. You know my face. You know the interior of my properties. You are a loose end. I won't say anything, I swear to God. Panic clawed up her throat, shrill and jagged. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. People who promise to disappear rarely do, Nico murmured. He turned his back on her, walking toward the door. Rest. The situation will be resolved by midnight. Resolved how? Naomi screamed, lunging forward until the chain snapped taut, jerking her backward. Are you going to kill him? Are you going to kill me? Nico paused with his hand on the doorknob. He didn't look back. I run a business, Naomi. I don't waste resources. And right now, you are a very expensive, very complicated resource. He opened the door and walked out. The deadbolt snapped shut, leaving Naomi alone in the grey twilight, the word resource echoing in her ears like a death sentence. Time stretched into a thin, agonizing wire. Naomi paced the length of her chain, 8 feet forward, 8 feet back. The carpet fibers flattened beneath her pacing feet. She counted her steps. She counted her breaths. She stared at the frosted glass window until her eyes watered, watching the grey light deepen into a bruised, violent purple and finally, pitch black. Midnight. He had said it would be resolved by midnight. She sat on the floor, her back pressed against the side of the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Her ankle was a continuous, dull throb of agony. The dampness from the shower had dried, leaving the raw skin beneath the leather cuff tight and burning. She tried to wedge her fingers under the leather to relieve the pressure, but it was locked too tight. Footsteps in the hall. Naomi scrambled up, climbing onto the mattress, pushing herself back against the headboard. She pulled her knees up, making herself as small as possible. The door opened. Nico walked in. The hallway light cast a long, warped shadow across the bedroom floor. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a heavy black sweater and dark jeans. He looked exhausted. There were faint, purple smudges beneath his slate-grey eyes, and the sharp lines of his jaw seemed even more pronounced. He carried a small, white plastic box with a red cross stamped on the lid. He closed the door, hitting the light switch. The room flooded with harsh, artificial white light. Naomi flinched, throwing a hand over her eyes. "Put your leg out," Nico ordered. His voice was rougher than usual, lacking its smooth, conversational cadence. Naomi lowered her hand, squinting at him. "Is it midnight?" "It is 2 a.m, Nico said. He walked to the edge of the bed and set the first aid kit on the mattress. He pulled up the white plastic chair and sat down. "Give me your ankle." "What happened to Declan?" she demanded, refusing to uncurl her legs. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. "You said it would be resolved." "It is," Nico said flatly. He opened the plastic box, pulling out a bottle of brown liquid, a stack of white gauze, and a pair of trauma shears. "Declan will no longer be a problem for my ledgers. Now give me your ankle." The finality in his tone sucked the air from the room. Naomi stared at him, trying to read the microscopic shifts in his expression. Did he kill him? Did he break his legs? A sickening, confusing wave of grief washed over her, immediately followed by a sharp spike of guilt. She hated Declan for putting her here, but he was her brother. He was the only blood she had left. "Did you kill him?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Nico paused, holding a sterile cotton pad. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "I put him on a freight ship bound for Manila. He is working in the engine room to pay off a fraction of his debt to the captain, who happens to owe me a favor. He will shovel coal and scrub oil for the next 10 years. He is alive, but he is gone." Naomi let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It came out as a jagged, wet sob. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. She wasn't crying because she would miss him. She was crying because the last tether to her old life had just been severed. She was entirely alone. Nico didn't offer comfort. He didn't speak. He simply waited for the ragged edges of her panic to dull. After a minute, Naomi wiped her eyes with the back of her oversized sleeve. She sniffled, her chest heaving. Slowly, she extended her right leg toward him. Nico took her heel in his hand. His palm was warm, his fingers calloused but incredibly precise. He didn't handle her gently, but he wasn't rough. He manipulated her leg with the detached efficiency of a mechanic assessing a damaged strut. He picked up the small silver key, unlocking the padlock on the cuff. The heavy lock clicked, and he peeled the leather away from her skin. Naomi hissed in pain. The flesh around her ankle was a mess of bruised purple and raw, weeping red sores where the metal ring of the basement chain had bitten through the dermis. Nico inspected the wound. He unscrewed the cap of the brown bottle. "This is iodine. It will burn." Before she could brace herself, he soaked a cotton pad and pressed it directly against the raw skin. Naomi screamed. It was a sharp, involuntary sound. She jerked her leg backward, but Nico's grip on her heel was like a vice. He held her firmly in place, pressing the burning chemical into the infected wounds. "Hold still!" he commanded, his voice tight. "Stop! It hurts!" She grabbed the edge of the mattress, her knuckles turning white, tears springing hot and fast to her eyes. "Infection hurts worse," Nico countered calmly. He discarded the bloody cotton pad and grabbed a clean one, dousing it in iodine. He applied it again, methodically swabbing the entire circumference of her ankle. Naomi bit her lower lip, tasting copper, riding out the searing waves of pain. She stared at the top of his head, at the dark, thick hair, the broad shoulders pulling the fabric of his sweater tight. It was a bizarre, jarring contradiction. The man holding her captive was currently treating her wounds with meticulous care. "If Declan is gone," Naomi forced the words out between clenched teeth, "and the debt is handled, why am I still chained to a bed?" Nico finished swabbing the wound. He tossed the pad into the kit and pulled out a roll of white gauze. He began to wrap her ankle, pulling the bandage tight enough to provide support, but loose enough not to cut off circulation. "The debt isn't handled. Declan was merely removed from the equation," Nico said, wrapping the white tape around the gauze to secure it. "He owed 3.2 million. 10 years in an engine room barely covers the interest." "So you're keeping me until he pays it off?" Naomi laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound. "You'll be keeping me forever. I'm worthless." Nico stopped rapping. He didn't let go of her heel. He looked up, his slate eyes meeting hers. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. She could see the faint, dark stubble on his jaw, smell the sharp scent of iodine mixed with his cologne. "You're only worthless if you have no utility," Nico murmured. His thumb brushed lightly over the clean white bandage, a ghost of a touch that sent a strange, involuntary shiver up her calf. "And I am currently deciding what your utility is, Naomi." He let go of her leg. He picked up the leather cuff, wrapped it securely over the thick layer of gauze so it wouldn't bite into her skin, and snapped the padlock shut. He stood up, grabbing the first aid kit. "Go to sleep." He turned the lights off, leaving the room bathed in the grey glow of the bathroom window. He walked out, the lock snapping shut behind him. Naomi lay back against the pillows, her ankle burning, her mind racing. She was no longer a down payment. She was a project. And in Nico's world, that was infinitely more terrifying. Routine became a heavier chain than the steel locked around her ankle. days bled into a grey, featureless smear, marked only by the shifting quality of light filtering through the frosted bathroom window and the heavy, mechanical clack of the deadbolt. The swelling in Naomi's leg slowly receded beneath the white gauze, the sharp agony dulling into a stiff, persistent ache. But as her body healed, the psychological rot of absolute isolation took root. She paced, 8 feet to the bathroom threshold, 8 feet back to the bed frame. She memorized the weave of the synthetic carpet, the microscopic flaws in the charcoal paint, the exact decibel of the air conditioning unit kicking on. To keep her vocal cords from atrophying, she whispered recipes from the diner to herself. 2 cups flour, 1 teaspoon baking soda, a pinch of salt. She tried to conjure the smell of burning grease and cheap, acidic coffee to prove the outside world still existed, but the sterile scent of cedar and Nico's expensive laundry detergent overwhelmed her memory. He visited precisely twice every 24 hours. He brought plates of rich, heavy food, medium-rare steak, buttered root vegetables, thick stews that her shrunken stomach struggled to digest. He would set the tray on the mattress, pull up the white plastic chair, and sit. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was a dense, combative thing. Naomi chewed her food deliberately, keeping her eyes fixed on her plate, hyper-aware of his gaze tracking her movements. She hated how much she began to crave the sound of his hard-soled shoes in the hall. She hated that his presence, the very man who kept her caged, had become the only anchor keeping her tethered to sanity. On what she estimated was her 3rd week, the routine fractured. The door opened, but Nico didn't have a tray. He carried a thick, black, leather-bound ledger, a stack of loose shipping manifests, and a silver fountain pen. He tossed the pile onto the grey duvet. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. Naomi stared at the books, then up at him. He wore a tailored navy suit today, the knot of his silk tie perfectly symmetrical. "You balanced the till at the diner," Nico stated, crossing his arms over his chest. It wasn't a question. "It was a diner," Naomi rasped, her voice thick from disuse. "I counted 20s and rolled quarters. I didn't run a cartel." "Math doesn't change its nature based on the commodity," Nico replied smoothly. He pointed a long finger at the ledger. "Page 84. 3 columns. Shipping tariffs, fuel expenditures, and customs bribes at the port of Baltimore. Tally them. Cross-reference them with the loose manifests. Find the discrepancy." Naomi pulled her knees to her chest, the chain clinking softly against the wood. "And if I refuse?" Nico didn't blink. "If you refuse, I remove the books, I lock the door, and I turn off the bathroom light for 48 hours. Her lungs seized at the threat. The phantom weight of the pitch-black void pressed down on her chest. She looked at the crisp white pages of the ledger, then at the pen. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. The metal barrel was cold. Nico watched her uncap the pen. He didn't smile, but the rigid line of his shoulders relaxed a fraction. He turned and walked out, locking her in with the numbers. For the next 4 hours, Naomi did not pace. She sat cross-legged on the mattress, her finger tracing columns of figures that represented millions of dollars in illegal logistics. She smelled the dry, metallic scent of the ink. She heard the crisp whisper of the heavy paper turning. The math was complex, deliberately obfuscated by whoever had entered the data. But it was logical. It had rules. Unlike her life, the numbers behaved exactly as they were supposed to. When Nico returned, she handed him a single sheet of paper. "Your foreman in Baltimore is skimming," Naomi said, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "He's inflating the fuel costs by 6% on every outbound freighter and hiding the overage in a shell corporation listed under the maintenance budget." Nico took the paper. He scanned her neat, precise handwriting. He didn't look surprised. He slipped the paper into his suit pocket. "I suspected as much," he murmured. "I needed verification from a party with no allegiance to him." "Do I get a reward?" she asked, her tone dripping with a brittle, cynical edge. "A longer chain? A window that actually opens?" Nico looked down at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn paperback book. He dropped it on the bed. It was a battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. "You get a distraction," Nico said. From that day on, the ledgers became a daily occurrence. Naomi became complicit in her own captivity, her sharp mind untangling Nico's laundering schemes, finding the bleeding margins in his distribution networks. She stopped wearing the oversized sweatpants, trading them for tailored slacks and silk blouses he had brought in. She washed her hair. She ate everything on her plate. The dynamic shifted. It wasn't a softening. It was a mutation. Nico began to linger. He would stand over her shoulder while she worked, the heat radiating from his chest, the sharp, spicy scent of his cologne mixing with the faint smell of gun oil clinging to his clothes. He would point to a line item, his bare arm brushing against hers. Every time they touched, Naomi's body betrayed her. A hot, involuntary shiver would race up her spine. She hated herself for it. She was trauma-bonded, developing a pathetic, textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. Yet the self-awareness did nothing to stop the flush in her cheeks when he praised a calculation. She was no longer collateral. She was an employee, but the chain remained locked around her ankle. Atmospheric pressure plummeted, making Naomi's ears pop. Outside the concrete walls, a violent summer storm had broken over the city. Muffled, heavy booms of thunder vibrated through the floorboards, completely drowning out the ambient hum of the estate's climate control. Naomi sat on the edge of the mattress, an open ledger resting on her thighs, her pen hovering over a column of offshore wire transfers. The frosted glass in the bathroom flickered erratically with bursts of blue-white lightning. The heavy lock clicked, but the sound was hurried, sloppy. The door shoved open, hitting the rubber stopper on the baseboard with a violent thud. Nico stepped inside. He didn't look like the immaculate, terrifying ghost of the ledgers. He was drenched. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair, flattening it against his forehead. The shoulders of his charcoal suit were soaked black, but it wasn't just rain. A dark, wet smear of crimson stained the crisp white collar of his shirt, and his knuckles were split open, bleeding sluggishly onto the plush carpet. The smell of ozone, wet asphalt, and the sharp, hot tang of fresh blood flooded the stale air of the bedroom. Naomi dropped the pen. It rolled off the ledger and vanished into the duvet. She stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. Nico didn't speak. He closed the door, leaning his full weight against the heavy wood for a second. His eyes closed. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. Slowly, he pushed himself off the door and walked heavily toward the bed. He bypassed the plastic chair. He sat directly on the mattress, mere inches from her hip. The mattress dipped under his solid weight. Up close, he smelled like violence and exhaustion. A jagged cut slashed across his left cheekbone, welling with dark blood that dripped slowly down to his jawline. "There's iodine in the bathroom," Naomi heard herself say. Her voice sounded thin, completely disconnected from her brain. Nico opened his eyes. They were completely flat, stripped of their usual calculating distance. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by whatever butchery he had just returned from. "Carmine is dead," Nico said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. The foreman from Baltimore. He decided he didn't want to explain the missing fuel budgets. He brought a shotgun to the sit-down. Naomi's stomach plummeted. She had found the discrepancy. Her neat, precise handwriting had essentially signed a man's death warrant. The reality of the numbers she manipulated every day suddenly materialized as a corpse on a warehouse floor. She swallowed hard, tasting bile. "Did you kill him?" she whispered. Nico looked at his torn, bloody knuckles. I corrected the ledger. He reached into his saturated slacks. His fingers, slick with rainwater and blood, fumbled for a moment before extracting the small silver key. He didn't hand it to her. He leaned forward, his broad shoulder brushing against her knee. He reached down to her right ankle. He slid the key into the heavy steel padlock securing the leather cuff. The lock clicked. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Nico pulled the pin. The heavy chain hit the carpet with a muted thud. He peeled the leather cuff away from her skin. Underneath, the flesh was scarred, a ring of pale, thickened tissue where the rust had bitten her weeks ago. He tossed the padlock onto the floor. He sat back, resting his bloody hands on his knees. Naomi stared at her bare ankle. The phantom weight of the steel remained, a heavy, invisible pressure sinking into her bones. She rubbed the scar tissue with her thumb, her breathing shallow. "What is this?" she asked, not daring to look up at his face. "Your utility has exceeded your brother's debt," Nico stated. He stared straight ahead at the blank charcoal wall. "You found $4 million in operational leaks in 3 weeks. Declan owed 3.2. You bought your own contract." He stood up. He didn't look at her. "The door is unlocked. There is a town car idling at the bottom of the driveway. The driver has an envelope with $20,000 in untraceable cash, a clean passport, and a plane ticket to Montreal. You have 30 minutes before the gates lock for the night." He turned and walked toward the bathroom. "Leave the ledgers on the bed." The bathroom door clicked shut. The shower turned on, the water hitting the tile in a deafening hiss. Naomi sat frozen. The chain was on the floor. The door was ajar, a sliver of bright hallway light piercing the gloom of her room. She was free. The word felt completely alien on her tongue. She stood up. Her right leg trembled. She took a step toward the door, her bare foot sinking into the carpet. There was no metallic clack to stop her. No sudden, vicious pull on her calf. She walked to the threshold. She put her hand on the cold brass knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was long, lined with expensive art and expensive shadows. It was quiet. It led to a staircase, a front door, a car, a plane, a city she didn't know. She stood in the doorway, staring at the exit. If she left, she had nothing. Declan was shoveling coal in the belly of a freighter. Her apartment had undoubtedly been cleared out by her landlord. She was legally missing, effectively a ghost. Outside this estate was a vast, terrifying void where she was nothing but a victim waiting for the next predator. She looked back over her shoulder. The room was dark, austere, and suffocating. It was a cage, but it was her cage. In this room, she had power. She commanded the numbers that commanded the monster. Nico had bought her flesh, but she had systematically embedded herself into the very architecture of his survival. He needed her mind. The water continued to run in the bathroom. He was washing the blood off his hands. Blood she had put there. Naomi let go of the brass knob. She pulled the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, final click. She walked back to the bed, the phantom weight on her ankle feeling strangely like an anchor, keeping her from floating away into nothing. She picked up her silver fountain pen, flipped to the next blank page in the ledger, and waited for Nico to step out of the dark. Wow. Did Naomi make the right choice, or did she just lock herself in a deeper prison? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dark, twisted dive into Mafia Nicoce, please smash that like button. It helps the channel immensely. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow Dark Nicoce readers, and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss a single story. What do you want to see Nico and Naomi face next? Drop your ideas down below.